Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of Beyond the Grid. It's talk show where we like to explore the power grid, the people behind the grid, powering its very existence, and some of the big ideas shaping the future of energy and electric utilities. For the very first show, we have Jason Doering, who is a vice president of corporate operations services at ENMAX, a company most algorithms, particularly Calgarians, fondly know and use on our day-to-day life. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks, George. Good to be here on this initial inaugural episode.
Yeah, I have to thank you for helping me come up with the mechanics of the show. The show was originally, or the podcast was originally just an idea for me, and then it was like, okay, who do I interview? I've been following you on LinkedIn for a while, where you post lots of good insights, specifically it concerned to the energy industry, the utilities industry, and then. When you announced your retirement, I was like, it's now or never, right? Yeah, I have my first speaker. There you go. And then it was all about, okay, what do I name it now? Right. So it was a lot of conversations about what do I name it. And thank you, Jason. You kind of helped me narrow down quite a bit. I was just interacting with my generative AI friend to figure out, okay, what are the topics possible? What are the titles possible? It was giving me very boring answers at some point. And then it was telling me goofy things like, okay, maybe what's up or what matters, right? And finally, with interactions with you, Jason, we landed in this beyond the grid. I also asked her like, what should be the tagline? And again, very boring answers in the beginning. Then I asked her like, make it humorous a little bit more. And you know what it came up with? The tagline was, let's talk about the least sexiest industry in the world. I'm like, that's it, buddy. I'm not talking to you. So maybe we should start there. Jason, do you truly think this is the least sexiest industry in the world? What's your perspective?
Well, I think it's the best industry in the world. That's why I spent my whole career here. But honestly, for many years, like I'd say for I don't know, the majority of my career in the power business, we've kind of been the geeks in the back room, just squirreling away on the power system, and nobody really cared what we did as long as the lights stayed on and the power stayed cheap. Nobody really seemed to bother with us. But
Exactly.
now in this age of electrification and renewables and green policy, suddenly we're the cool kids now, right? Everybody has an opinion on the electric system. Everybody wants to be involved. We want to electrify everything, and suddenly we're in the spotlight. So I think it's a great time to be in the utility business.
Terrific, terrific. Now, let me dive a little bit more deeper into some of the physics behind the grid. What's baffling to me often is people only think of it as, okay, I switch on the light, the power comes on, right? They only get bothered when the power doesn't come on. Or I look at my month-end bill, I only get bothered when the bill is, higher than what I expected it to be. Those are the only two big times when people really focus on what powers the grid. But there is a lot more to it, right? Things like you have to be at the right voltage, you have to have the right frequency. There's a lot of technical jargon with it. Maybe demystify it a little bit for maybe my 13-year-old, so she could do better.
Well, yeah, George. I mean, because I think we in the utility business, we kind of have been in the shadows, right? For a lot of years, for almost 100 years. And, we really haven't, I'd say, put a lot of effort into educating the public or even kids in school on the power system and
Yeah.
some of its nuances, how it works, the different types of generators that we have and the different characteristics they have. And so I think that the general public and the policymakers, in their defense, they really don't understand much about the power system. So I think the complexity of the system is really what makes it interesting from an engineering standpoint, but what also means that the decisions that we make on how to use the system, how we add things to the system, how we plan the system, those decisions, they will have a critical impact on how operable the system is, how reliable it is, and how much it costs, right? And honestly,
Yeah.
for consumers, like all these things at the end of the day, they end up on your bill. So I mean, that's to me one of the big, I think, issues we've faced over the past 7 or 8 years as we've seen government policy increasingly trending towards green initiatives and renewables and low carbon solutions. The grid's become the focal point for that, but unfortunately, a lot of policymakers aren't well educated on the grid, and so there isn't a good understanding of some of the decisions that are being made. But I mean, to dumb it down maybe a little bit, like you say, for a 13-year-old, I mean, basically we have to generate electricity from various sources, and it has to be consumed instantly. We don't the one of the key characteristics of the power grid is that consumption and like demand and production happen almost simultaneously, right? There isn't, we do have some storage now being developed and being integrated into grids, but it's relatively small scale. And the one of the things that really makes the grid complex to operate and maintain is the fact that there's this instantaneous use of power when it's generated. And
Right.
so because of that, that's why things like frequency and voltage become so important, right? It's not just a matter of, generating a bunch of electrons and then we can store them up and use them when we need them. We have to balance supply and demand instantaneously every second.
Yeah.
So in order to do that, you have to maintain a very tight control over your frequency and voltage, or else bad things happen. And, we saw that recently in Spain.
Yeah, I was reading about that.
Right. And Spain's an example where, now I haven't, you know, disclaimer for everybody listening or watching, I have not, taken a deep dive into this yet, but just the little bit that I have seen from the report looks like it was a voltage problem. And, that's a good example of the complexity of the power system. It's not just a matter of do you have enough supply to meet your demand? Do you have enough of the right characteristics
Correct.
to support that demand in addition to just the electricity, right? You need voltage support and you need frequency support in order to make sure that that electricity can be delivered reliably and the grid can remain stable. And when it doesn't, then you get situations like Spain where you can have a collapse of the grid.
Yeah, and I was reading about in that article they talked about how it was cascading, right? It was a few going down that further impacted the voltage
Right.
quality and turning it down all the way. And they also talked a lot about the fact that conventional power plants offer a lot of inertia, right? Without
Yes.
even struggling to do it. Whereas some of these newer renewables, wind or solar, maybe they don't offer as much. And that becomes a problem to manage, right? Because you need to have that inertia to balance it out.
Yeah, exactly. And, and that's another, not really very well understood or even known aspect of the power system by many people outside of the power system is, inertia, the essentially the physical energy contained in rotating machines, generators, turbines and generators, that physical energy, that
Yeah,
inertial energy actually has a huge power system, positive impact. And the alternating current power systems, which we use across over the world, they depend on inertia and they depend on inertia to maintain frequency. And so you need that a certain level of inertia to provide primary frequency response for your system so that as your supply and demand, they're always changing, right? People are switching on lights and turning on pumps and generators are, sometimes they trip, sometimes the power line gets taken out of service, somebody runs into a pole. Like there's constant small changes, sometimes big disturbances in supply and or demand. And so what you really require is a certain amount of frequency support and you get that from inertia. And that allows you to ride through any of these disturbances. Think of it like a bike, right? That's maybe a good
yeah,
analogy people can relate to is a bike. What keeps you moving on the bike and keeps you upright is inertia, right? It's the spinning wheels. And so once you get up to your kind of your cruising speed, let's say, and for the grid that would be 60 hertz. That's the frequency that we operate in North America. And in Europe, it's 50 hertz. That's why you need all those adapter thingies when you go over there. But in North America, it's 60 hertz. And so once you get up to your kind of cruising speed on the grid of 60 hertz on your bike, your theoretical bike, if you've got a bike with kind of big wheels and it's a relatively heavy bike, like think like maybe an e-bike, right? It's got a lot of inertia, right? It's got a lot of momentum, a lot of mass that you're moving. And that actually, if you stop pedaling, if there's a small disturbance, like you run over a bump or there's a little wind gust, it doesn't slow, you don't slow down that quickly, right? You
sure.
ride through it pretty easily and you just have to pedal a little bit to get back to your cruising speed. It doesn't take a lot of effort to maintain your 60 hertz, your cruising speed. But if that bike, maybe you took a wheel away or you had a much lighter bike, right? Or with very, smaller wheels, less mass, suddenly now a little disturbance will affect your speed significantly. And so that bike will slow down significantly if you hit a little bump or if you get a wind gust. And so, what we've had traditionally on grids is everything, all the generators were either gas or steam turbines, right? Steam turbines driven by coal plants, initially most of the power in the grid was coal plants, hydro plants in areas that have hydro, like, British Columbia, Manitoba, Quebec, right? Big hydro plants, they're spinning masses, they're, lots of inertia. But what we've got now is with wind and solar, and we're seeing a lot of those types of generators added to power systems across the world, those don't actually provide physical inertia. They're actually connected to the grid through power electronics. And now that provides energy to the grid, but it doesn't provide physical inertia, right? And so when you have a lot of those resources online, a lot of wind and solar online, providing electricity, and not a lot of the traditional machines, hydro, steam turbines, gas turbines, then what you end up with is your inertia is dropping on your system, and the system's ability to withstand those disturbances is kind of like the bike, right? It's like a much lighter bike, or you take one of the wheels off the bike, and all of a sudden, boy, you get knocked off course pretty easily, right? So it's kind of what we're seeing on the grids now, is the changing nature of the generators is actually having an impact on the system operator's ability to maintain frequency and voltage control.
Yeah, but aren't they also exploring several synthetic inertia
Mhm.
options, right? Things like storage is obviously one.
Yep.
And I think there was like something that can ramp up really fast. There was something about just motors, spinning motors, which is not generating anything, but it's just for inertia, right?
Yeah, exactly. What you're talking about is like a synchronous condenser, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's actually in Texas, in ERCOT, they've installed several synchronous condensers across their system to help maintain frequency and voltage support with all the renewables that they've got connected there. So I
And
do,
that's a lesson they learned with those blackouts that they had a couple of years ago.
yeah, there was a big disturbance. I want to say it was 2021. Don't quote me on that, but you can look it up. It's called the
Around
Odessa,
there.
yeah, the Odessa disturbance. What you had is kind of like a cascading outage of a bunch of wind generators. And again, I think the industry's learned a lot from events like that. NERC put a lot of effort into lessons learned and understanding that event, and that has actually led to some changes in the technical rules for inverter-based resources for wind and solar, and the parameters they have to meet to connect to the grid. Here's the good thing too. I mean, I guess we can call them conventional now, but currently the renewables that are being sold by the manufacturers are what are called grid following resources. So the power electronics for the inverters have been programmed assuming that they're going to essentially get kind of the required voltage and frequency support from the grid, right? They're grid following. But the nice thing about power electronics is you can program them. So there are what is called grid forming resources. And that means that they actually can be programmed to kind of provide, as you say, like synthetic inertia and some levels of voltage support. So, unfortunately, the industry kind of developed around grid following resources because I don't think anybody anticipated we'd get to a situation where you'd sometimes have more inverter based than you'd have synchronous resources, i.e., traditional generators. But I think now what you're seeing is more effort being put into grid forming resources. So I do think in the longer term, what we're going to see is we're going to see those power electronics being used to help the grid, and that will probably evolve over time, and it'll help reduce some of the issues, some of the operational challenges we've seen with grid following resources.
Yeah, understood. But this problem is sort of something we tackled immediately, right? Because if you look at the growth of renewable, be it just simple rooftop solar,
Yeah.
heat that people are putting in their homes now, they are the thing to go now, right? EVs, that's a big load on consumption. All of that. Solutions, are they catching up with the scale the problem is developing?
No, I think that's part of the problem is I think the growth in these new resources and the other thing to remember here too is there's also impacts, there's different impacts. There's impacts on the transmission system and the distribution system. So are the solutions keeping up? Not really. I think the there was a lot of incentives, government incentives, policy incentives against renewables, EVs, storage, that meant those things developed pretty quickly before grid operators and distribution system operators were ready. And so, what we've seen is on the transmission system, you've seen this explosion of renewables before I think grid operators had a chance to really understand the impacts of inverter-based resources on system operations and reliability once you scaled up. So it scaled up a little bit quickly. Grid operators are now a little bit of catch-up mode trying to figure it out. I think we'll get on top of it, but it definitely they we didn't have the solutions ready for the scale of that came. Now on the distribution system, this is where we're seeing a lot of activity as well. So you're seeing, like you said, rooftop solar. We're seeing sometimes storage. People are putting it in on the distribution system in their houses and businesses. We're seeing EVs, right? Lots of EVs. People are buying EVs and they're putting chargers in their houses. There's charging stations being installed publicly. The distribution system, again, wasn't really ready in some jurisdictions for the scale and the speed at which those things hit their system. And so now we're seeing voltage problems. We're seeing overloads because,
Yeah.
this is adding significant demand, right? If you're charging an EV, it might double the demand that had been assumed from your house. So, we're in a bit of a catch-up mode, I'd say, on both the distribution and the transmission system. And the good thing is, I think that's starting to become well known to governments and policymakers. And so, I'm seeing a little bit of a pause in that and a little bit more recognition that we have to give system operators a chance here to catch up
Yeah.
and maybe slow things down a little bit so that we can get the right outcome. Because really I think this is the evolution of our grids, and I don't think we want to block progress, but at the same time we need to be progressing at a pace that's reasonable and that's responsible and that allows us to maintain reliability and a reasonable cost, because all of these things end up costing consumers, right? And we have to be careful about that, because the grid also, in addition to adapting to all these new things that are hitting it, we've got to replace our infrastructure. A lot of the infrastructure in our grids is, pushing 50 years old, and that has a lifespan, and that has to be replaced, and that has a cost. So that's all going to hit consumers.
Yeah. And I was recently talking to a few of our clients about things like, hey, transformers, right?
Mhm.
Transformers, they had a pattern to it. They would up and be serving the meters behind it. And then at some point, it gets a chance to cool down in the night, right? Because it's not overloaded anymore. You charge put 5 EVs into that mix, and it's charging overnight. All of a sudden, the transformer doesn't have an opportunity to cool down.
Yeah,
What does that do to the useful asset life of the transformer? How
yeah,
do you plan for maintenance, right? Those are
yeah,
all big problems evolving from this change. And you earlier said about, hey, the cost of power, the ability to balance out some of these considerations. So important, because people think of it as, okay, go renewables, that's the best way to go for it. It quickly becomes a political, philosophical conversation, but there's a very practical component to it, right? Like making sure that we still have reliable power, making sure that all these systems can catch up so we're not going to Spain kind of blackout mode, because it can be pretty life threatening here in Alberta, colder countries, colder.
yeah.
Yeah, it can be life threatening, right?
It
And then
yeah,
balancing it with energy affordability. That's
right.
such a huge thing. And it's that balance that we need to drive toward.
Absolutely right. It's like all things in life, right? It's about balance. There can be too much of a good thing.
Yeah.
And I think the important thing, I mean, I don't expect people who aren't power system engineers and are immersed in this stuff like we are to understand all these technical nuances. But I think the important thing that people need to take away, if they take away one thing from this discussion, it's that, all generators are not the same. And,
Yeah.
a wind generator has very different characteristics than a gas turbine generator. And neither is better or worse than the other. They're just different from a physical perspective, from a physics perspective. And I think one of the problems, I think that one of the underlying issues that's got us to some of the grid challenges we've got today is that policymakers and decision makers at higher levels have kind of assumed that a generator is a generator, that a megawatt's a megawatt coming from a generator, and that's just physically not the case. And so because
Not 2 megawatts are the same, right?
no, and because of that, they're not interchangeable, right? And so, they all provide electricity and they all generate energy, but the characteristics that they have are extremely important for maintaining a stable and reliable grid. And so I think that was kind of something that wasn't appreciated when maybe some of these policies were put in place, was that you just can't, shut down a coal plant and replace it with wind and solar. Like, yes, you can replace the energy, right, the electricity component, but you're losing things like the voltage support, the frequency support, and those things are as important as the electricity itself when it comes to operating the grid reliably and maintaining stability on the grid. So I think, again, I think just if people take away one thing, it's that they are different. The different generators have different characteristics, and that's very important when it comes to grid planning and operations.
I was reading a recent post. I think you recently posted about ELCC, right?
Mhm.
As a way to look at this problem as not 2 megawatts are equal. There is a difference, and why is a difference, right?
Right.
Maybe dive a little bit into that.
Yeah, well, and again, it's really around understanding the contributions that generators provide to reliability and grid operations, right? And load carrying capability for different types of generators, it's important to understand because, again, it's back to just because let's say you have 800 megawatts of wind, right?
Yes.
the All 800 megawatts does not, like, you can't count on all 800 megawatts to be there when you need it to serve load, right? And there's also kind of like a scaling effect, and more is not better sometimes. And so I think understanding, how that scales up and how that works as a system, right? Because it's, really the power system is a complex system and it will have surprising outcomes. And so on the surface, what might look intuitive might not actually be the case in reality. So, understanding the load carrying capability of your various types of generators, especially as they scale up and especially given the different load characteristics that you might have in your power system, that's really important, right? To understand the limitations and to understand, operationally, what can you count on as a system operator to serve your load reliably? And what do you have to, what kind of margin do you have to build in, and what kind of reserves do you have to carry, ancillary services, those kind of things to make sure that you're always able to serve load? Because that's, first and foremost, the number one job of every system operator, whether it's in a deregulated market like Alberta or a fully vertically integrated, regulated jurisdiction like Manitoba, the number one job of a system operator is to keep those lights on, right, and keep the system reliable. And so, in order to do that, especially now with this kind of changing nature of the generating fleet, they need more information and they need more tools to make sure that they can make, good planning choices, and that they can make sure that they've always got, sufficient resources online that are going to help them maintain reliability.
Slowly, slowly. Great. Terrific. Shift gears a little bit. US, Canada, trade, those top of everybody's mind. Our system is pretty integrated with our neighbors to the south. We work well for a reason, for a creed. But at some point, you're starting to think about, is that the right thing to do or not, right? Any perspectives that you have? I know there is a Western interconnection that we're connected to Alberta, BC, etc. And then there is Eastern, and then there is Quebec has its own separate thing as an interconnection. But your perspectives on how it's structured right now and how it could change to our advantage.
Yeah, well, so, for people who maybe aren't overly familiar, like, if you listen in the media, they talk about the grid in North America like it's one big thing. And while it is interconnected, they're not all synchronized. And again, now we get into, more of the geek speak, but the reality is, in North America, Canada, and the US, this doesn't include Mexico, we basically have four grids, right? You have what's called the Western Interconnection, and they're all called interconnections. The Western
Yeah.
Interconnection, which is Alberta and BC in Canada, and then you kind of draw a line north to south somewhat, and that's cuts through the states, the Western states. So there's this
Montana, Washington.
yeah, so there's this Western interconnection, and that's kind of the west side of North America. And then there's the Eastern interconnection, which is kind of the central, let's say. It includes, the central provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, maritime provinces, and then kind of most of the east of the US.
Yeah.
That's the Eastern interconnection. And then ERCOT, Texas, is its own interconnection, so it's kind of separate. And then Quebec, as you mentioned, it's its own interconnection. It's a separate. Now, when I say separate, I mean they're not synchronized, meaning even though, they all operate at 60 hertz and a nominal voltage of 120 volts when you go to, to consumer level. So you don't have to carry little adapter thingies when you go across North America,
Right.
but they're not synchronized. So they operate independently of each other from a frequency perspective.
Yeah.
So, and how they're connected is through direct current lines. So high voltage direct current lines is how we
Frequency
connect
lines. Yeah.
between them, right? And so we exchange a lot of power. Now, in the interconnects, they're really, and what they do is they divide Canada across three different interconnects, synchronous interconnects with the US. And that was not designed through any grand plan. I'd say it kind of evolved over time as the grid grew and we started to interconnect more and more states and provinces. Originally, the thinking was just interconnect all of North America, one huge grid. But what they found was as they got more and more interconnected, it became harder and harder to control this great big huge grid. And so, over time, it was decided to break it up into smaller chunks that were easier to manage and maintain and operate. Not maintain, sorry, easier to operate, right?
Yes.
So that's how the grid developed, and that's where we got today with these four interconnects. Now you get into energy security issues. We never really thought about that, right? We were so integrated with the US and never really thought, like, is energy security something we have to worry about, or can we always rely on being strongly interconnected with the US and exchanging power just freely? But the recent events and maybe a shift in the approach in the US really does kind of force you to rethink that a little bit. And maybe we do have to think about, can you go to one synchronized, or maybe two synchronized Canadian interconnects?
Yeah. Nice.
And again, then this would be expensive, would take time, but in theory, what you could do is you could take the provinces and you could synchronize them. And instead of having a break between the eastern provinces and the eastern interconnect, and you got BC and Alberta in the western,
Yeah.
we could synchronize across those provinces and go to HVDC connections to the US and create, like a northern interconnect. And then depending on whether you could, from an operability standpoint, could Quebec then connect and you could have one
Got it.
big Canadian interconnect, or would you maintain Quebec separate and just interconnect the rest of Canada? Now, again, I'm not saying that's something that's going to happen overnight, but it is, I think, technically possible. And then you can share the benefits, right? Like we talked about
Yeah.
frequency and voltage support. Those things only are possible if you're synchronized. So right now, when you're like across Canada, like say in Alberta, right? We have an HVDC, a high voltage direct current connection to Saskatchewan. We can only exchange electricity with Saskatchewan. We can't exchange frequency support and voltage support, right?
Yeah.
So, now if we were synchronized, you would get those benefits, right?
Correct.
The question is, what's our view on energy security? What's our view on the long-term health of Canada and the long-term uh, relationship with the US? And do we want to start thinking of our power grid as more along national lines than we had historically? So I think that's a question that, I think we have to think about, especially if we see this increasing sentiment from the US on really trying to separate itself from Canada, something to consider.
Got you. Got you. And I would think there is an argument for sort of true nation building through that, right? You get exposed to a lot of diversified sources of power, right? BC is more hydro. Alberta doesn't have a lot of hydro. Go to Manitoba, it's different. Go to Quebec, it's different, right? So integrating all of those could start to address some of these inertia problems that we talked about,
Yeah.
black start capabilities, things
Yeah.
of that. Right. So I would think it's a huge benefit that way.
Definitely, right? I mean, when you look at the diversity of resources we have in Canada, we are a net exporter of electricity.
Yeah.
So the reality is, in theory, we could be self-sufficient. And we have, Alberta is a thermal jurisdiction, right? Lots of natural gas, but also lots of renewables, right? We've got great wind resources, great solar resources in sunny Alberta. BC, fantastic hydro. Saskatchewan thermal, again, there's uranium there. So if, hopefully we get into nuclear in the future, if we start to develop nuclear, especially in the thermal provinces like Alberta and
Yeah,
Saskatchewan, and then Manitoba, blessed with all kinds of hydro. Same with Quebec. Ontario's got hydro as well. So the diversity of resources across Canada is tremendous. And so, yeah, you could get those benefits. Now, the other issue we'd have, it's not just technical, it's political and it's jurisdictional, where we've got a market in Alberta, right? You've got you've got fully regulated, government controlled grids on all sides of us. And
exactly.
so you'd need political cooperation, and you'd need to really think through jurisdictionally, how does everybody benefit? Because honestly, right now, there's a lot more money to be made on the power system by selling into the US than there is selling across Canada. So that's
But
another, not a technical barrier, but that's another structural barrier we'd have to get over. But again, I think if you take a long-term view and you think about it from a nation building standpoint, and you think about it from, how does Canada benefit first, then, maybe that is something you start working towards over the long term.
yeah, and what is true nation building versus not, right? That's kind
That's
of
right.
what it's about.
That's right.
And just on that note, like we talked a little bit about transmission and how to make this happen either through AC current or HVDC lines. I'm also always baffled by how people think that, hey, I can put like a big solar farm in the middle of Arizona and power pretty much everything in North America, right? Without even thinking the cost of building
Yeah.
those transmission lines to get that across. If in fact Musk has talked about this a couple of times, right? And I'm like, such an intelligent man coming from him, it was just very hard for me to swallow.
Yeah, and that's back to, I think, what we talked about earlier is, a megawatt is, all megawatts are not equal, right? And
Exactly.
and so, yeah, sure, putting solar in the desert makes sense, right? Not a lot of usable land, you got a lot of sun, but there's transmission. The transmission cost is significant to move those electrons to the load centers, to the grid, to where you can use it. And then you have to also be concerned about voltage and frequency support. So, those things can be done. And that's the thing. I mean, all this stuff can be done, but there will be a cost to that. And you do have to consider the technical characteristics of these things and how they're going to integrate into the grid to maintain reliable operations.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. I think we are at what time now? We are 40 minutes into this.
Oh, okay.
Great.
Yeah.
Didn't even realize it's going good. Maybe shift gears a little bit. I just want to listen a little bit about your career, right? How did you start? How did you end up in this career? Et cetera, et cetera. If you could highlight some of that.
Sure. So, I didn't plan on getting into the power business. Actually, when I first went to university, I didn't know what I was doing. Ended up with a psychology degree with an applied math minor. So I really didn't have a plan. I just kind of stumbled around and followed things that I was interested in. So, I went back to school a little bit later, and was very focused this time. I got a mechanical engineering degree, and I focused on aerospace, and specifically aerospace propulsion, so gas turbines. And really, I was headed for the aerospace industry. I wanted to basically work on gas turbine engineering. And as life is, it's nonlinear. You can have a plan, and then there's reality. And I wound up getting offered a job at Manitoba Hydro as an EIT, as an engineer in training. That was a great job, and it was working on thermal generators. At the time, Manitoba Hydro had coal plants, coal-fired power plants, as essentially backup plants to their hydro system. I mean, at that time, I think they were 98% hydro energy, and the thermal plants were really backup for low water flow years. And they needed a maintenance engineer to help with the plants. And I had turbine and theoretical knowledge from school.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so they hired me to be a maintenance engineer. And you know what, George, I got into the power business, and I thought, wow, as an engineer, there is a career's worth of work here. Everywhere I look, there's interesting stuff to do. There's problems to solve. There's interesting equipment. It's just endless. That started my journey in the power business, and I never looked back. And I also love the sense of purpose, the fact that, working in the power system and being a power system engineer, you're doing something I thought that really was important to society. And so it gave me a sense of purpose to
Can I agree?
be, yeah, to be in the power business. And I just love the technical challenges. So I was a maintenance engineer for 4 years, just over 4 years. And then I got into planning. I had the privilege of being in Manitoba Hydro's integrated resource planning function. And so I got to do a variety of roles in resource planning, learning the hydro system and how the various resources integrated, supporting the sales to the US, the export sales. And then in 2008, I came to Alberta. I got an opportunity to join the Alberta Electric System Operator, and I oversaw the ancillary services market for 3 years, and that was fantastic. Got to learn all about ancillary services and just the Alberta market in general. It was kind of immersed in it. During that time, I also spent some time as a liaison to the government when they were making some policy changes in 2009, 2008. And then I had the opportunity to oversee transmission system planning for the ISO, and that's when we did the big build out of 500 kV lines here. We did two high voltage direct current lines in Alberta
Yeah,
between
I've those days, yes.
yep, the Western Alberta transmission line, the Eastern Alberta transmission line, Wattle and Eagle. We did the Fort McMurray 500 kilovolt line and a whole bunch of 240 additions to really strengthen the system, prepared for all these renewables that are here today. And so I had the privilege of doing that for a few years. And then I got to oversee operations engineering and planning. And so that's all the operational planning and support for the grid operations. So that was that was fantastic. Got to really get immersed in grid operations. Went through the Fort McMurray fire, which was just a pretty stressful but really interesting time just to look at the skill of our system operators and our
Oh,
planners,
I can imagine that.
yeah, just watching everybody come together and watching them manage a power system where we were losing lines every half an hour, and just looking at how quickly we could reconfigure and keep the lights on. Like when you look at how reliable the system stayed during that event, that's just a testament to the skill and talent that you have at the ISO. So I did that for 3 years, and then I decided I want to get back to the kind of back to the grassroots, and got an opportunity to go to ENMAX and oversee engineering and maintenance for the combined cycle fleet and the gas turbine fleet. And that was fantastic. Really got to kind of, in some ways, go back to where I started, right? Back to power generation and being in the plants and supporting the operations for ENMAX for our gas turbine fleet. So that's fantastic. And then did that for about 4 years. And then I got into this job. I had an opportunity to oversee safety, environment, supply chain, security, facilities operations for the corporation. So to support ENMAX's entire business, the T&D business and the generation business. So that I've been doing that for the last 4.5 years. And yeah, now I'm about to retire in one
We'll
week.
get to that. We'll definitely get to that. Yeah, but I mean, it kind of resonated with me what you talked about the AESO, right? I did spend a lot of time with AESO back in the days 2008 to 2020 or so, so about 12 years.
Yeah.
And that was my, although I've been working with utilities throughout my career, just to get that 360-degree view,
Yes.
that was the AESO, right?
Yeah.
And a deeper appreciation for what the system controllers do.
Yeah.
Who about like some of the most brilliant minds in the power industry? People don't realize that. Everybody thinks it's out Silicon Valley and developing new pieces of software and LLM models and things of that sort. That's talent. That's brilliance. But there is a lot of brilliance within the system control center or
Yeah.
within system planning group or wherever. Right, the work that they do is amazing, and usually with the tools that they do it, right? Like it's not the most fascinating, most advanced all the time, but they
No.
make it work. And every decision is a split second decision, right? Like you gotta react to the real time conditions of the grid. So I have a tremendous amount of respect for that. I do have a lot of some system controllers that I can call friends now. We meet every once in a while, grab a beer. It just so fascinating to listen to them talk about problems and how they solve it and all that.
The system controllers and the system operations engineers, these are the unsung heroes, the unsung heroes of the power business, right? Like these are the people that 24/7 are sitting in a dark room with giant screens on the wall, watching
Yeah,
frequency and voltage constantly. And as you said, making split-second decisions. And sure that, the tools are relatively sophisticated, but there is so much judgment and experience
correct.
and knowledge required to make those decisions. And, I think that's who you should be interviewing next here on this podcast is yes, because I think the public would do well to hear more from our system controllers because they're the ones on the front lines of this, this energy transition. And, I think it would be interesting for people to hear their perspective because this has created challenges for them that they've never seen before, right? It's really pushing their knowledge and their skills to the limit some days just to keep the lights on. While we're blissfully unaware in our houses, surfing cat videos. You've got a group of people that are, they're doing all they can to keep this system off the ragged edge on some days. So yeah,
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
have utmost respect for the system controllers and the people who run operations for the power systems because they're the ones that we rely on and they're the ones that nobody ever sees, right? They're hidden in dark rooms and nobody knows what they do, but these are the real heroes of the power system.
Absolutely. I do have it on my list of next set of interviews. I just need to line up the right person and get all the permission to do it because they
Yeah,
can't just
yeah.
come through and talk about it, right? They have to be a little more controlled that
You
way.
got to get a retired one.
Yeah, that's a good idea. But the one I mostly want to talk to is not retired. He's got a lot of fascinating stories that I know of. So I'm working through that. Maybe get a retired one first. Yeah, that's what I'd
Maybe
do.
maybe you can do like the voice masking thing,
With AI, construct an AI system controller and interact with it, right? Yeah, we'll do that.
There you go.
We'll do that. The other group that I want to really interview is somebody who spent their career in field services, right? Like
Yeah,
just maintaining lines.
yeah,
That's also, it's a lot of hard work we don't necessarily understand
yeah.
because they're out there when the
Every
snow
day.
is sideways, when there's power lines going down, then it's raining cats and dogs, and they're maintaining it such that we all of us are comfortable sitting in our homes, right? So a
Exactly.
lot of respect for that group too.
Yeah, I mean that's, the days when we don't want to go outside, when it's too cold, when it's too wet, they're the ones that are out there, on a pole in a bucket and doing the hard work of keeping our lights on and keeping us warm and dry, right? So, yeah, that's another. The power system has so many people that are uncelebrated, I'd say.
Yeah.
And the only people that the public sees are people like me in management positions, but we're not the ones that really are doing the hardest work, right? That's happening on the
Yeah.
front lines in control rooms, in buckets, in trucks.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And that's one of the reasons why I want to do this, right? It's about bringing those stories to light, right? And maybe
Yeah,
sometimes you read from them, um, in the layman's term possible, right?
yeah,
For people to
exactly. Plain
understand.
English, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Although we did get into some geeky stuff, still understandable, I think, right? We kind of sort of kept my 13-year-old as sort of the gold standard
That's
for
right.
her. Let's talk a little bit about your retirement. You're retiring at the young age of 55, which is a tremendous milestone in my mind. So what led to that decision? What are you looking forward to?
Yeah, I think life is short, right? You don't know what the future holds. And
Yes.
I think, my wife, Crystal, and I, quite a while ago, we decided like if we could retire at 55, that gives us a real chance to, enjoy our time to the maximum extent possible. Because you don't know how long you're going to live. You could live to 90, you could live to 70, right? And
True.
as much as, like I love my career, I love the power business. But I think, you're at some point, I think you have to start valuing your time more than money. And let's face it, what we're doing in our jobs is we're trading our time for money, right? And we sat down and came up with a plan and said, look, this is how much we think we're going to need to live the lifestyle that we have evolved to. What's it going to take to be able to retire at 55 and maintain that lifestyle? And we set a target, and we worked pretty aggressively towards that. Paid down debt and made, I'd say, lived well below our means. Small sacrifices really for kind of the end goal, which was to have full agency over our time. And so yeah, we structured it so that by 55 work would be a choice, not a requirement. And here we are. And that's the situation. The plan worked, and we decided, yeah, let's take this opportunity to really live life on our terms and really have full agency over our time. And, well, continue to do power system stuff? Absolutely. I'll continue to write. I'll continue to read. I mean, I love this business. Like I said, there's a lifetime of challenges. And now with this energy transition, challenges are being added every day, but it's going to be really around, I'm a big cyclist. I'm going to spend a lot more time on my bike. I got a mountain of books to read. We're going to travel a little bit more. And it's just really, I would just say like living, learning, riding, and enjoying and seeing where life takes us next. You just never know. And I'm going to enjoy every day.
You're an avid biker, aren't you? Like you do spend a lot of time
Yeah,
biking.
I do. I do. Yeah,
Any
I try and get
anything
out almost every day.
nice?
And it's tough when you're working, right? It's always in the evenings and, you may be a little bit tired, but now I can just go at 11 o'clock in the afternoon because I don't have any meetings to go to. So
Well, I envy you, but I should have planned it a little bit more better. We'll get there at 55. Maybe I can get there by 60.
it's not
Maybe I
too
should take
late. It's not too late. Just start planning.
you should start planning, have that open conversation with my wife and see. I'm pretty sure she'll be on board.
Oh yeah, yeah. You know what? It's like anything, right? I think you have to, just set a goal and, it just it's just chip away at it, right? Just don't try and eat the elephant in one bite. Like every day you're making choices with, what do you do with your money? What do you do with your time? Just if you've got a long-term goal to work towards, I think that'll really help guide those choices and those trade-offs that you're making. And sometimes you don't even think about it, but if you have that longer-term goal in mind, I think that helps you really stay focused. So you can do it. You'll be there. I'll see you out there on your bike.
Yeah, we'll see. So, what is the one thing that you will miss from your corporate life, if you miss anything at all?
The people. You know what? I love being surrounded by all these super smart people, and I learn so much every day just talking to all these intelligent people, from all different, backgrounds and educational backgrounds. And, that's the part that I really enjoy is the people and the social aspect too, just the laughs, but the learning. Like it just intellectually, I love working with a bunch of smart people. And I have that, I've had that privilege in every company that I've worked for, Manitoba Hydro, the ISO, ENMAX. I mean, I'm just surrounded by super smart people every day and I just soak it up. I learn, I get a lot of energy from them. So that's the part I'm going to miss. I am. So, hopefully lots of people call me up for podcasts and beers and stuff. So I have somebody to talk to and learn from.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think I know what you won't miss. You likely won't miss the meetings.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that, are necessary in any job. Yeah, meetings, maybe some of the drudgery that comes with corporate life. And that's just the nature of the beast, right? That's just the unfortunate reality of how we get things done in the corporate world. And yeah, some of those things I won't miss, but yeah, it's the people. It's the people, it's the learning, it's just like I said, the energy that I get, the positive energy I get from being around all these super smart people with all these different perspectives. It makes my days really enjoyable.
Great. Terrific. I think we are probably close to the end of our time, but thanks for making this happen. My very first sit down, and I'm glad it was you. Jason, thanks a lot. All the best with your retirement. And I'm pretty sure I'll be hearing more from you, reading more posts from you, and I'll be following them along. And we will one of these days we will catch up maybe for an episode number 3, 4, whatever the case, right?
Yeah, well, for sure, George. Thanks for having me. And I'm honored to be your first guest. And good luck with this. I think it's a great idea. I think people want to understand the power system more. And I think platforms like this, are a great way to communicate that stuff to people and help educate people and just give them a source to go to learn more and to develop a deeper understanding and an appreciation for the power system and the people that run the system. Like we said, system operators, the field services people. Like there's these hardworking people that I think it would be great for the public to hear from. So I think this is great, and I wish you all the best with this podcast. Great idea.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Yeah.
I'll see you soon.
Okay. Take
Bye.
care, everybody.